Like many other members on this committee, even on both sides, we are seeing that unelected bureaucrats at the SEC are almost every day finding new ways to make life a lot harder for my constituents back in Iowa. Bureaucrats at the SEC sit in Washington, D.C., and they make decisions that have a direct impact both at Main Street, at my folks back home, my consumers, and ultimately American families. Never before has an SEC chairman been so well known, in fact, outside of Washington, D.C., and that's not something to be encouraged by. It's something that has a chilling impact. When the Director General noted that the SEC would recommend aggressive use of enforcement tools, we would never have guessed that it would go so far. And in addition to the amount of rulemaking that the agency at the SEC continues to undertake, the fear of SEC enforcement and the regime forces companies to hire additional FTEs. It's something I hear about every day in my office, whether it's new attorneys that needed for compliance, whether it's audit officers that they're paying, or whether it's an outside compliance agency. These are costs that have a real impact. This disruption is made only worse when the SEC opts to use enforcement over rulemaking as a policy tool, something that is only stick and no buy-in with a good carrot. I understand the support needed for strong enforcement for bad actors, but treating everybody as a bad actor is no way to do business, and certainly not one that should come out of Washington. So I'd like to get started with Mr. Morgan. Let's talk about government regulation by enforcement. Many, including past and current SEC commissioners, have highlighted what I've just noted, that the practice of regulation by enforcement is chilling. Commissioner Hester Peirce stated that the SEC should avoid regulation by enforcement to be respectful to the due process of rights of the firms that we regulated, and I would say down to Main Street businesses. Mr. Morgan, would you please elaborate on the negative consequences when unelected bureaucrats eliminate the stakeholders' input in this process?
Happy to. So one immediate impact is we don't know what the law is. So long as the SEC is free to set its policy on a case-by-case basis, they can suffer an adverse ruling in the D.C. Circuit, for example, and yet come after your constituents in Iowa for the exact same conduct a year later, 5 years later, 20 years later. And so what that does is it discourages people from taking any risk in the capital markets, and that burden and that disincentive falls predominantly on people who are not traditionally part of the capital markets. So people are just going to stay away because they fear getting hammered by the SEC and being destroyed financially and professionally.
And so the negative consequence here is that not only are they trying to adhere to the law, they're trying to guess as to what the law might be in the future and taking on a large financial burden. Does that have an follow-on impact to the consumer when more money is being diverted from your mainstay business to trying to avoid future unforeseen regulation?
Yeah, I think the main negative impact there is that we just won't see the innovation. It just won't occur. People won't take the risk to introduce a new financial product. People won't try to raise money for small businesses because they fear falling afoul of the SEC. Even if they're not accused of fraud or investor harm, the consequences are devastating.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Mr. Ecker, I'd like to talk a little bit now on the innovation in AI, please. Specifically, the SEC plays a vital role in protecting investors, especially as new products emerge. That's something we want to see. However, many of us know that the SEC has also taken an extreme evidence that was recently sanctioned by a federal judge, saying that the SEC regulators' conduct towards a blockchain company constitutes a gross abuse of power. The direct result of what Mr. Morgan has just highlighted is that Debtbox ultimately paid the final price of going out of business because of SEC overregulation in this area and kneecapping the American economy. You would think that having lawyers called out by a federal judge as being grossly incompetent would force them to change their action, but in fact, despite significant legal setbacks in the digital asset space, the agency increased its digital asset-related enforcement sanctions by 50% last year alone. I would like to submit this article in projection to what some of my colleagues have highlighted that submit how these losses are piling up and the SEC's record is increasing despite this. Mr. Morgan?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Has the SEC regulation enforcement created a hostile environment for capital formation in America and put us at a disadvantage?
I think that was a question for me.
Yes.
Yes, it has, and I think we see the evidence of that by the number of people who would like to be involved with our fabulous capital markets, but who fear the negative consequences from the SEC's regulation by enforcement policies.
And Mr. Eckert, in our last minutes, how has this chilled the innovation coming out of our areas?
Well, again, as Mr. Morgan said, you see new products not coming to market where there's uncertainty. In the past, the SEC has been much more vigorous and willing to do things like entertain no-action letters that give comfort to new entrants. than they are today, where they sort of sit back and wait.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentlemen, time has expired, and